In the waning days of World War II, as Allied forces closed in on Nazi Germany from every direction, Soviet soldiers discovered something that would baffle scientists, historians, and conspiracy theorists for nearly 80 years: a massive bell-shaped object made of an unknown metal alloy, scarred with mysterious symbols, buried deep within a mountain fortress in Lower Silesia. An object so strange and so utterly inexplicable that its very existence would spawn countless theories about secret Nazi technology, interdimensional travel, and experiments that pushed the boundaries of human understanding in ways that the world was never meant to know. The device, which would come to be known as the Nazi bell, or Die Glocke in German, has become one of the most compelling mysteries of the 20th century. A tantalizing puzzle that sits at the intersection of legitimate historical inquiry and wild speculation, forcing us to ask uncomfortable questions about what the Nazi regime was truly capable of, what secrets they took to the grave, and whether there are still answers waiting to be discovered in classified archives, buried somewhere in the depths of governmental vaults. But before we can understand the mystery of the Nazi bell, we must first understand the historical context from which it emerged. The desperate final years of the Third Reich, when Adolf Hitler and his inner circle were willing to embrace any technological innovation, no matter how far-fetched or dangerous, if it offered even the slightest hope of turning the tide of a war they had already lost. By 1943 and 1944, Nazi Germany was hemorrhaging on multiple fronts. The Eastern Front had become a graveyard of German soldiers. The Western Allies had established themselves in Normandy, and the relentless bombing campaign by the Americans and British had reduced German cities to smoking ruins and broken the morale of the civilian population. It was during this period of desperation that the Nazi regime began pouring massive resources into what they called Wunderwaffen, or wonder weapons, secret weapons programs designed in hidden laboratories and underground, bunkers that were supposed to be so revolutionary, so destructive, so utterly devastating that they would somehow reverse Germany's military fortune and deliver final victory to the Third Reich. Most of these programs were rooted in real physics and engineering. Projects like the V-2 rocket, the Me-262 jet fighter, and advanced submarine designs that were genuinely innovative for their time. But there were other programs, darker programs, that ventured into territory that was far more speculative and esoteric. Programs that seemed to blend together engineering, physics, and something that looked suspiciously like science fiction. It was in this shadowy realm of cutting-edge and dangerous research that the Nazi bell supposedly took shape, a project that allegedly involved some of Germany's finest scientific minds, unlimited funding, and access to resources that most researchers could only dream of, all operating under a veil of absolute secrecy in a location so remote and so heavily guarded that even many high-ranking Nazi officials didn't know it existed. The story of the Nazi bell really gained prominence in the early 2000s through the work of Igor Witkowski, a Polish journalist and author who conducted extensive research and interviews with former Nazi scientists and military officers who claimed to have worked on or observed the project, though it's important to note that many of Witkowski's sources were never independently verified, and some of his more spectacular claims remain deeply controversial even among historians, who take the Nazi bell seriously as a historical artifact worthy of study. According to Witkowski and the sources he interviewed, the Nazi bell was a device approximately 9 feet tall and 6.5 feet in diameter, roughly bell-shaped as its name suggests, constructed from a material called Xerum 525, an unknown metallic compound that supposedly had properties unlike anything that conventional metallurgy could explain, a substance so exotic that its very composition has never been definitively established despite decades of research and speculation by scientists who have examined the few available photographs and historical documents. The device apparently had a crystalline internal structure and contained 2 counter-rotating cylinders made of this mysterious metallic substance, And when these cylinders were set in motion at extremely high speeds, the device supposedly began to generate electromagnetic fields of unprecedented power and scope, fields that were said to have produced effects that ranged from the merely unusual to the absolutely impossible, depending on which account you believed. Some accounts suggest that the Nazi bell was designed as a weapon, a kind of electromagnetic cannon that could disable electronic systems or vehicles at great distances, which would certainly explain why the Nazi military would be interested in it as a potential war-winning technology in the final desperation of the war. Other accounts, however, make far more sensational claims, suggesting that the Nazi bell was actually designed to manipulate space-time itself, that it was part of a secret Nazi program to develop teleportation technology, or even to open portals to other dimensions. Claims that immediately put us on shaky ground as far as historical reliability goes, because we're now venturing into territory that sounds far more like science fiction than anything that could have been seriously pursued by even the most visionary scientists of the 1940s. And yet, despite how outlandish these claims sound, there is a persistent thread of testimony from credible witnesses, including former Nazi scientists who survived the war and lived long enough to share their stories, military officers who claimed to have seen the device, and even accounts that appear in declassified government documents, all suggesting that something genuinely strange was being worked on in the deepest recesses of the Nazi research apparatus, something that didn't fit neatly into any conventional weapons program or scientific project that the Western Allies had encountered elsewhere in Nazi Germany. The location where the Nazi bell was supposedly developed and tested was a place called Projekt Riese, literally Project Giant in German, a massive underground complex built into the Owl Mountains in Lower Silesia, an area that is now part of Poland but was part of Germany during World War II, a sprawling network of tunnels and bunkers that stretched for miles and required the forced labor of thousands of prisoners to construct. A dark chapter in Nazi industrial history that involved the slave labor system in all its brutality and horror. The complex was designed to be self-contained and absolutely hidden from aerial reconnaissance, built deep enough that no amount of bombing could reach it, and equipped with everything needed to support the weapons development programs that were being conducted there, including living quarters for the scientists, manufacturing facilities for constructing components, testing grounds where experimental devices could be safely detonated or activated without being detected by the Allies, and all the supporting infrastructure needed to maintain operational security while working on some of the regime's most sensitive military programs. According to the accounts that have survived, the Nazi Bell Project brought together some of the most brilliant scientific minds that Nazi Germany could muster, including physicists, engineers, and specialists in fields that were so far ahead of their time that the work being conducted at the facility could barely be comprehended even by other scientists who were working on conventional weapons programs. And these researchers were given essentially unlimited resources and complete freedom from normal bureaucratic constraints, because the Nazi leadership believed that whatever they were working on could be genuinely transformative for the war effort. The project allegedly began sometime in the early 1940s, though exact dates are difficult to establish because most of the records were either destroyed as the Nazis retreated or disappeared into Soviet possession after the Red Army overran the facility. And by most accounts, the work continued in absolute secrecy until the very final days of the war, when Soviet forces were closing in on the region and the Nazis made the decision to evacuate the facility and destroy the evidence of what had been developed there. The exact nature of what the Nazi bell was supposed to do remains genuinely unclear, and this is where we must be very careful to distinguish between what can be reasonably inferred from available evidence and what has become pure speculation and conspiracy theory. Because there is a real historical artifact here, a device that was found, that was examined by Soviet scientists, but the records of that examination were classified and sealed away for decades, creating a perfect vacuum for wild speculation to flourish. What we know with reasonable confidence is that Soviet forces did discover a large bell-shaped device when they overran the Projekt Riese complex in May 1945. That they initially thought it might be some kind of secret weapon or advanced military technology, and that the device was examined by Soviet scientists before it disappeared into the Soviet archives, presumably being shipped back to the Soviet Union for further study, and that it apparently ended up in some kind of storage facility where it reportedly remained for decades, though the exact location and current status of the device remains unknown and possibly forever lost to history. The mysterious disappearance of the Nazi bell after Soviet capture is one of the most frustrating aspects of the entire story from a historical perspective, because if the device could be scientifically examined by independent researchers using modern techniques, many of the questions that surround it could potentially be answered. The composition of the mysterious metal could be definitively established. The internal mechanisms could be understood, and we could finally put to rest the numerous theories and speculations that have grown up around it like weeds in an abandoned garden. But the Soviets, famously, were not eager to share information about their discoveries in Nazi Germany, and the device fell into that murky area of Cold War espionage and classified military research, where it was sealed away from public scrutiny, examined only by Soviet scientists working under government control, and eventually lost to the historical record in a way that makes it virtually impossible to verify the claims that have been made about it. The story of the Nazi bell gained new life and new urgency in the decades after the fall of the Soviet Union, when declassified documents and interviews with former Soviet officers began to reveal what had actually been found in Nazi Germany, including the bell-shaped device, which began to receive serious attention from researchers and historians who were intrigued by the mystery and eager to separate fact from fiction. Some researchers have attempted to track down the current location of the device, following leads through Russian archives, conducting interviews with former Soviet military personnel, and scouring declassified documents for any mention of what happened to it after it was seized in 1945. But these efforts have largely been unsuccessful, and most historians now believe that the device has been permanently lost, either destroyed or hidden away in some obscure storage facility where it may never be rediscovered. But even if the physical device is gone, the intellectual and historical questions it raises remain as fascinating and as challenging as ever, because the Nazi bell represents a window into the shadowy world of Nazi advanced weapons research, a world that we know existed but which remains only partially understood. A world in which the boundary between serious scientific inquiry and wild speculation was often difficult to distinguish, particularly when dealing with projects that were shrouded in secrecy and worked on by researchers who were often willing to push ethical boundaries in pursuit of technological advancement. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Nazi bell story is the testimony of eyewitnesses and people who claim to have worked on or observed the project. Testimony that has been preserved in interviews, books, and declassified documents, and which provides some of the most compelling evidence that something genuinely unusual was being researched at Projekt Riese, even if the exact nature of that research remains unclear. One particularly significant piece of testimony comes from Igor Witkowski's research, in which he interviewed Hans Kammler, a high-ranking SS officer who was allegedly involved in overseeing various classified weapons programs, including the Nazi bell, and according to Witkowski's account, Kammler provided detailed information about the bell-shaped device, describing its appearance, its supposed function, and the general parameters of the research that was being conducted on it. Information that was consistent with accounts from other sources, and that provided a framework for understanding what the Nazi bell might have been and what it was supposed to do. Hans Kammler himself is a fascinating and troubling figure in Nazi history, a man who rose to prominence in the Nazi regime's military-industrial complex, and who was involved in overseeing some of the regime's most ambitious and most secret engineering projects, and who disappeared in mysterious circumstances at the end of the war, possibly being captured by the Americans possibly by the Soviets, possibly escaping to Argentina or another country with Nazi connections, a man whose ultimate fate remains unknown, and who has become something of a legendary figure in conspiracy theories about Nazi advanced technology and secret escape routes. The fact that Kammler was allegedly involved in the Nazi Bell project lends it a certain credibility, because Kammler was genuinely connected to real Nazi weapons programs and was known to have access to resources and authority that would have been necessary to conduct research on such a project. But it also means that we must be cautious about accepting testimony from Witkowski's interviews at face value, because much of what we know about these interactions comes from Witkowski's accounts, which have not been independently verified in all cases, and because the passage of time and the trauma of the war could have affected the memories of the people being interviewed. The actual scientific plausibility of the Nazi Bell is a matter of considerable debate among people with actual expertise in physics and engineering, and this is where the conversation about the Nazi Bell often breaks down into two distinct camps: those who believe that the device was working on something scientifically plausible, like advanced electromagnetic weapons or weaponized plasma technology, and those who believe that the claims about the Nazi Bell have spiraled into pure fantasy, with speculation about teleportation and time travel that has no basis in established physics and that should be dismissed as the product of overzealous imagination and poor critical thinking. The camp that is skeptical of wild claims about the Nazi Bell points out quite reasonably that the laws of physics as we understand them don't support the possibility of teleportation or interdimensional travel, that there is no credible evidence that any government in the 1940s, including Nazi Germany, possessed the theoretical knowledge to pursue such things, and that the proliferation of these claims is more indicative of the cultural appetite for mysteries and unexplained phenomena than it is of any genuine scientific reality that was being pursued during the war. On the other hand, proponents of the Nazi Bell as a genuine advanced technology point out that Nazi Germany did pursue some genuinely innovative projects, that the regime had access to brilliant scientists and unlimited funding, that there were experiments being conducted in various laboratories that pushed the boundaries of contemporary physics, and that it's possible, if unlikely, that work was being done on technologies that were so far ahead of their time that we still don't fully understand them, and that the Soviet suppression of information about the device is itself suspicious and suggests that they found something they didn't want the Western world to know about. The truth, as is often the case with historical mysteries, probably lies somewhere in the middle, with the Nazi Bell being something that was real and that was genuinely unusual and technologically advanced for its time, but probably not something that involved actual teleportation or interdimensional travel, but rather something that was working with more conventional, if still cutting-edge, physics and engineering. Something like an advanced electromagnetic weapon, or a device for manipulating plasma, or for generating powerful electromagnetic fields, technologies that would certainly be worthy of interest to a military power desperate for a war-winning weapon, but that wouldn't require overthrowing our understanding of the fundamental laws of physics. The electromagnetic weapon theory has some genuine credibility, because the Nazis were indeed conducting research into electromagnetic effects and radiation, and because such weapons were theoretically possible even with the technology available in the 1940s, and because such a device would explain why the Allies and the Soviets were interested in it after the war, why the Soviets would be eager to suppress information about it, and why it would have been viewed as a weapon of potential strategic importance by the Nazi regime that was desperate for any advantage it could find. The story of the Nazi Bell is also deeply connected to the broader story of how Nazi technology was actually transferred and distributed after the war, a process that involved American and Soviet intelligence agencies engaging in a kind of competition to capture Nazi scientists and technology before the other side could get to them. And in some cases, this competition led to what became known as Operation Paperclip, a program in which the Americans recruited German scientists including some who had questionable histories with the Nazi regime, to work on American military and space programs. Scientists who brought with them knowledge of advanced technologies that the Americans wanted access to, and who contributed significantly to the American space program and the American military-industrial complex in the post-war years. The fact that there was such active competition to secure Nazi scientists and technology after the war is itself telling, because it suggests that the Nazis had indeed developed some genuinely advanced technologies that were worth fighting over. And it raises the question of whether the Nazi bell might have been one of those technologies, something that the Soviets captured, but about which they were unwilling to share information, and which might have disappeared into Soviet archives as a classified and forgotten relic of the war. The declassification of various government documents over the past few decades has provided us with more information about what the Nazis were actually developing in their secret weapons programs. And while most of what we've learned has been interesting but not revolutionary, it has confirmed that the level of resources being poured into advanced weapons research was genuinely extraordinary, that the Nazi regime was willing to pursue technologies that were highly speculative and whose practical utility was questionable, and that there was a significant culture of pushing boundaries and attempting to develop weapons that didn't exist yet, and that required fundamental breakthroughs in science and engineering to make possible. But even with this additional information, the Nazi bell remains something of an enigma, a device that fits into the general pattern of Nazi advanced weapons research, but that stands out even among those programs for the mystery that surrounds it, the lack of clear documentation about what it was supposed to do, and the persistent stories and legends that have grown up around it claiming far more than we can actually verify. The question of whether the Nazi bell was actually a working device or whether it was simply a piece of experimental apparatus that was never fully completed or tested is one of the most fundamental questions about the entire mystery. Because if it was merely an experimental device in the early stages of development, that would be one thing. But if it was actually a functioning technology that had been tested and that was producing the kind of effects that some of the accounts describe, that would be quite another, suggesting a level of technological advancement that would be difficult to explain, given what we know about the state of science and engineering in Nazi Germany. The accounts that have survived do seem to suggest that the device was more than just a piece of experimental apparatus, that it had actually undergone testing, and that tests had produced results that were dramatic enough to command the attention of the highest levels of the Nazi military and scientific establishment. But these accounts are based on hearsay and recollection rather than on contemporary documentation that could definitively establish what actually occurred. One of the most interesting and most speculative aspects of the Nazi bell story is the connection that some researchers have attempted to draw between it and modern conspiracy theories about advanced technology, UFOs, and secret government programs, suggesting that the Nazi bell might have actually been connected to something even stranger than what most people think, that it might have represented contact with non-human intelligence, or the reverse engineering of non-human technology, theories that immediately take us out of the realm of historical evidence and into the realm of pure speculation and science fiction. These theories are deeply problematic from a historical perspective because they layer unfounded speculation on top of uncertain evidence in a way that makes it virtually impossible to separate fact from fiction. And because they tend to attract people who are more interested in conspiracy theories and fringe ideas than in genuine historical inquiry, which makes it more difficult for serious researchers to investigate the Nazi bell as a historical artifact without being immediately associated with wild and unfounded speculation about aliens and ancient astronauts. The responsible approach to the Nazi bell is to acknowledge that something unusual was being researched at Projekt Riese, that a strange bell-shaped device was found by Soviet forces after the war, that this device was examined by Soviet scientists and then disappeared into Soviet archives, that the exact nature and function of the device remains unknown, and that while it's possible that the device was working on cutting-edge technology that was beyond the understanding of most contemporary observers, The claims that it involved teleportation, interdimensional travel, or contact with alien intelligence lack any credible evidence and should be treated with extreme skepticism. The historical significance of the Nazi bell lies not in whether it was actually a reality-bending superweapon or whether it was just an advanced electromagnetic device, but rather in what it tells us about the nature of the Nazi regime, about its desperation in the final years of the war, about its willingness to pursue any technology no matter how speculative or dangerous, and about the limits of our understanding of this period of history, the gaps in the historical record that remain, despite decades of research and declassification of documents. The Nazi bell represents a moment in history where the verifiable facts run out and where speculation takes over, and this is perhaps where its real fascination lies. Not in any concrete answers that it can provide about secret weapons or advanced technology, but in the questions it raises about what we think we know about World War II, about the capabilities of Nazi Germany's scientific establishment, and about the hidden corners of history that still remain unexplored despite the enormous amount of attention that has been devoted to studying the Nazi regime and its various projects and programs. The search for the Nazi bell has also revealed something interesting about the nature of historical inquiry itself, about how historians and researchers must balance the need to pursue intriguing mysteries with the need to maintain rigorous standards of evidence and methodology, about how speculation and imagination can sometimes lead us astray, but can also sometimes help us ask better questions about what actually happened in the past, and about how the passage of time and the loss of documentation can turn genuine historical events into mysteries that may never be completely solved. The Soviet destruction or suppression of information about the Nazi bell, if that's indeed what happened, robbed history of the opportunity to definitively establish what the device was and what it was supposed to do. And this loss of evidence is itself a historical tragedy, one among many that resulted from the Cold War division of Europe and the different approaches that the Soviet Union and the Western powers took toward capturing, studying, and either using or hiding Nazi technology and Nazi scientific expertise. If the Nazi bell were to be rediscovered today, if it emerged from some Russian archive or was found in a hidden bunker or storage facility, it would immediately become one of the most important artifacts of the entire World War II period, something that would finally allow us to answer the questions that have fascinated researchers for decades, to definitively establish what it was, how it worked, and what it was supposed to be used for. But the likelihood of such a discovery at this point seems quite remote, and we may be forced to accept that this particular mystery will remain unresolved. A tantalizing fragment of history that points towards something that we can't quite understand or fully explain. The Nazi bell story also serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked technological advancement in the service of an evil regime, about how brilliant scientific minds can be corrupted and directed toward terrible purposes, and about how the pursuit of absolute power and absolute victory can drive people to abandon ethical constraints and to pursue technologies that are dangerous not just to the enemy, but potentially to humanity as a whole, a theme that resonates throughout the study of Nazi science and that remains relevant to contemporary discussions about the ethics of scientific research and the responsibility that scientists bear for the uses to which their discoveries are put. The legacy of the Nazi bell is not ultimately about whether it was real or imaginary, whether it was a working device or a failed experiment, whether it involved cutting-edge technology or pure wishful thinking, but rather about what it represents as a window into a crucial moment in history, when the Nazis were reaching desperately for any advantage that might save them from the defeat that was becoming increasingly inevitable, when the regime's scientific apparatus was channeling resources into projects that were growing increasingly exotic and increasingly divorced from the practical realities of the war that was being lost on every front. And when the line between serious scientific inquiry and desperate fantasy was becoming increasingly blurred in the face of military catastrophe, the persistence of the Nazi Bell story in popular culture, in conspiracy theories, and in the imagination of researchers and enthusiasts around the world, speaks to something deeper than just the mystery of the device itself. It speaks to a broader human fascination with hidden history, with the idea that there are secrets still waiting to be discovered, that official historical narratives might be incomplete or deliberately obscured, and that the truth about the past might be far more dramatic and far more surprising than what we think we know from the books and the documentaries and the historical accounts that have become the accepted narrative. As we consider the Nazi Bell and what it might have been, as we weigh the testimony of the people who claimed to have worked on it or seen it, as we examine the sketchy documentation and the circumstantial evidence that has survived, we must remember that we are dealing with a historical mystery that may never be completely solved, that existing evidence is fragmentary and often contradictory, and that the most responsible approach is to acknowledge the genuine uncertainty while resisting the temptation to fill in the gaps with speculation that goes far beyond what the available evidence can support. The Nazi Bell will likely remain a mystery, an intriguing footnote to World War II history, a device whose true nature and purpose will be forever lost to the fog of war and the deliberate suppression of information by governments that viewed it as strategically or politically sensitive. But in that mystery there is a real historical lesson, a reminder that even in an age of instant communication and widespread documentation, history can still contain secrets, that governments will still conceal information, and that there are still chapters of our past that remain fundamentally unexplained and perhaps forever unknowable. And that's perhaps a fitting legacy for a device that was created in the shadows and that disappeared into the shadows again, taking its secrets with it into the vast and murky archives of classified information that constitute so much of 20th century history.